But I think let's get straight into it. We have a presenter here, Lawrence Simonson. He'll be able to give an introduction further into the work that they do. But I work with Missourians for Responsible Transportation, which is a partnership focused on equitable, sustainable transportation issues. So we try to make sure that we work for streets, roads, and trails that work for all Missourians. And through that process, we have created a partnership of 4 similar organizations that are based in Columbia, Kansas City, Springfield, and St. Louis. So Lawrence is with our Columbia partners here at Local Motion, and he'll talk about a big thing that we focus on and how it relates to physical activity. So that's complete streets. So yeah, Lawrence, if you'll take it away. And then anytime, folks feel free to jump in or participate through the chat, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And if Jackson, you wouldn't mind monitoring the chat for me, that would be really great. First question I have for everybody is, can you see the correct screen, Jackson?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. So I introduced myself a second ago. My name is Lawrence Simonson, and I work for Local Motion, and I'm very honored to be invited to speak to you all a little bit about complete streets. And I'm going to say up front, I have a lot of slides, so I'm going to move pretty quick, but don't feel like you can't stop me and ask any kind of clarifying questions as I move along. So who we are at Local Motion. Local Motion, we are a non-for-profit local advocacy organization. And what we do is we focus on policy, infrastructure, and transportation. And on my slide there, I kind of call us policy, infrastructure, and transportation nerds, because we all get very excited about anything related to those items. I show this slide in a meeting and we all start talking about the design and get super pumped. We have a vision. Our vision is towns built for people, where it's easy to walk, bike, and ride transit, and everyone can get where they want to go. And we accomplish that by providing biking, walking, and transit solutions to meet people's everyday transportation needs. I say a lot about transportation. There is obviously a recreation component to all of this, and so that's pretty inevitable. And I'll talk a little bit more about why we focus on transportation, but what we really spend our time doing is advocating for policies and infrastructure that ensures that transportation is safe and convenient for everyone. And the 2 pieces I want to really point out when I say what we do is this convenience and for everyone. Oftentimes in our society, we build things that we assume are safe for all different modes of transportation, whether you're walking, biking, public transit, or even the automobile. But what we forget to leave out is the convenience piece. And if it's not convenient, people aren't going to use it. And even if it's maybe safe on paper, that it may not be actually, you may not actually feel safe in reality using some of the infrastructure that we build. And that piece about everyone, when I say everyone, we truly mean everyone. So when I look at a design parameter, what you should all know is when I look at something, I want to know, does it work for an 8-year-old? Does it work for an 80-year-old? Does it work for somebody who's sight impaired? Does it work for somebody in a wheelchair? If it doesn't, then I think we need to do better. If it does, then that piece of infrastructure will be better for everyone, including people that are temporarily able-bodied in places of privilege. And so by designing in this way with those design parameters I mentioned, it ends up making a better society for all of us. So why do we do this type of work? We do it because communities that are walkable, bikeable, accessible, and have thriving public transit systems are stronger, they're more equitable, they're happier, they're better for business, and they tend to be healthier. The one thing I want you to notice when I mention all these whys, why we do this work, I never once mentioned we do this so more people will bike. We do this so more people will walk. We do this so more people will ride the bus, or people will drive less. Those things are inevitable if we design a society in a way that focuses on walking, biking, and public transit. Our main goal is to actually make quality of life and communities and towns better. And we do that through this lens of walkability and bikeability and access to thriving public transit. So a lot of times people just always assume like you just want people to ride bikes or you want to take away their cars. Like, no, I don't. I want people's lives to be better. And we have, through research, case studies, and practice, have found that communities that are designed with these three modes of transportation in mind tend to be better communities in all of these metrics and more. So the problems we're trying to solve, and particularly here in Columbia, because we focus really heavily here in Columbia. We do some work outside of Columbia, but really, you know, many of you may know I work with Jackson, and we leave Jackson to do a lot of the statewide work with some of our partner organizations. So I say Columbia, but what we are trying to work on is trying to solve a problem that is the current road design standard. And the road design standards, as they are currently designed in every community in the United States, every community in Missouri, Columbia, Kirksville, Ashland, Joplin, no matter where you're at, they're all designed pretty much the same way. And those designs are outdated, they're inequitable, they're very dangerous. Generally, when we speak of, we have the most dangerous road system in the developed world. We see on average about 40,000 deaths per year on our roadways. And I think it's close to 3 million serious injuries on our roadways. And when I say serious injuries, I don't mean you get hurt and you're in the hospital for a couple of days. I mean, you get hurt and your life is forever changed. You may now have a permanent disability throughout the rest of your life. Something about your life has changed. They're incredibly inefficient. I know you've all been stuck in traffic, feel like you should get someplace faster than you already are. The number of people that can actually travel on our roadways is incredibly low for the amount of money we spend and the amount of asphalt that we pour. Speaking of which, that makes them very expensive. And let's be honest, they're very unpleasant. And I don't need any more proof than this picture I've shown right here of how pleasant a lot of our roadways can be. And I say this roadway here, I have a bigger picture of it later, but this picture, this roadway is the most common roadway design in the entire United States. Every town has this roadway design, and it is incredibly unpleasant. You don't say on a Friday night to your significant other, hey, let's take the kids and go walk down this road and go shopping and have dinner. But yet this is the type of roadway that we build most commonly in the United States. It's not just me in Missouri doing this work. There's a whole bunch of us that do this work. Obviously, you know Jackson from Missourians for Responsible Transportation, but we have friends over in St. Louis with TrailNet, friends in Kansas City with Bike Walk KC, and friends down in Springfield with Ozark Greenways. And so if you are near one of those areas and you want to know more, feel free to reach out to one of those organizations. And of course, you can always reach out to Jackson. So what you've actually brought me here to talk about is complete streets. Before I talk about complete streets, I think it's important that I give you a little bit of a history on streets, and then I'll talk a little bit about the connection of streets and physical activity, and then finally, what is specifically a complete street. I have a lot of slides on the history of streets. I'm going to, again, move quickly through them. But as I'm going through this, I want you to really think about the implications of streets and how they relate to our ability to be physically active, whether that be leisure time physical activity, so going out for a run, going out for a walk, going out for a bike ride, or even passive physical activity, walking to your work, walking to the grocery store to get some milk, kids going out and just playing, anything that may be considered passive, or even how they contribute to a sedentary lifestyle. So I'll move pretty quickly through this piece. Again, stop me if you have any questions, and I'll happy to, as Jackson knows, I can extrapolate and really nerd out on any one of these slides I'm about to show. So history of streets. There were streets long before this picture was taken. There were streets long before this road was designed, back in the Roman days. But I like to use this as a general basis for how streets basically started. They were just an open throughway for people to walk on, to ride their horses, buggies, push wheelbarrows, stop and chat, kids to play in. So they were just this open space that people moved through. There were really no restrictions, laws, or rules. And what we see on the side are wood buildings. These were the first buildings usually built in a place. And what looks like a porch, those are actually the start of what we call the frontage zone, in technical terms, or even the sidewalk that we know of today. As towns developed, Some of these wooden structures would be torn down and they would be built bigger or on top of with brick and mortar until we eventually grew to towns. Whoops, excuse me, go back a little here. Until we eventually grew to towns that look like this, these very thriving environments. Now, smaller towns obviously weren't quite this thriving, but they still had plenty of people meandering about, getting their daily needs met, going to the grocer, going to any other services they need. So a very active place. Again, no real rules or laws or anything, but people would meet here, people would play here, and people would socialize and get about their daily lives, and then even commute to what they needed to get to throughout the day. Then in about the 1910s, 1920s, we started to see the automobile start to come into play. And the problem here was twofold. The automobile, the people that drove automobiles were very wealthy individuals, owners of industry. And what they found when they came into these cities, it was very annoying for them because there was all these people in their way. There's a common term I like to use for when you drive in a car, and I challenge you to go practice this. But when you drive in a car through a community, the community and society is in your way, and you want them out of your way. But when you walk or bike or use public transit, you are part of that community. So that's one thing that happened when the car came along. The other thing that happened when the car came along is a lot of people that were in those roadways, horses, buggies, people, kids, they started being struck by these cars and being killed or seriously injured. What this led to was a huge national outcry about should we do with these cars. Those of you who lived in Columbia, maybe even Kansas City, St. Louis, understand the outrage when the bird scooters came to town. Very similar thing happened when cars started coming to town. People thought they were dangerous. They said they shouldn't be here, or if they are here, they should be heavily regulated. And we continue to see throughout that time lots of discussion about what should we do with the cars. And how can we protect our cities from being destroyed by the car? And so the one difference between the auto industry and the scooter industry, if I keep with that analogy, is, as I mentioned, cars were generally owned by very rich people. And so what that meant is they were owned by very powerful people with lots of influence and money. And so then the people that owned these cars started to fight back. And they started putting out a lot of propaganda that basically said you need to stay out of the street, that the streets are places for cars only. The reason we have a jaywalking law today is because they lobbied so hard to get people out of the streets that it became law that you could not walk across a street unless you're in a crosswalk or it's safe for you to go across and not interfere with the car. Does anybody, and I'm opening this question up, does anyone on the call know why it's commonplace to use the phrase car accident when there is a crash? Not hearing any responses. I'll tell you why. Because back when the Industrial Revolution came around, there were lots of, OSHA wasn't around. And so lots of people were getting injured on the job and hurt. And so the owners of these industries went to their lawyers, went to their insurance firms and said, hey, we're really worried about us getting sued and getting in trouble. What can we do to ensure that when someone's hurt in our factories, we're not liable? They said to start calling them accidents, because that means they're unavoidable. That means you're not liable. The owner's not liable. The business isn't liable. So start calling them accidents. So when these individuals started to own cars and they became together as a lobbying group, they went back to their lawyers and they went back to their insurance agents and they said, what do we do about this problem? They said, well, call it an accident. That way it's not the driver's fault. It's not the car's fault. It's not the car manufacturer's fault. It's the people that got hurt's fault, especially when you put out this type of propaganda. The propaganda continued, trying to tell people where they should be, walk on the left, facing traffic. So all this type of stuff came out of the auto industry, trying to push people out of the streets as a place for streets for everyone to a place that's only dominated by one mode of transportation. To the point, does anyone know why we have playgrounds?
I'm gonna make a wild guess that it's to get kids off the street playing and in somewhere where cars aren't gonna hit them and be in the way.
Correct, Jolynn, you get a gold star. So the auto industry started lobbying towns and cities to start building these playgrounds so that kids wouldn't be in the streets. They even funded and sponsored many playgrounds to help get kids out of the streets. And so then they put out propaganda like this, that if you were playing in the street and not at the playground and you ended up getting hurt as a child, that it's the child's fault, not the person driving's fault. So then in about 1930, a group of auto industry owners, there's much more of them, I think there was around 30, 35 or so, came together and started this group called the National Highway Users Conference. And what they did is they spent the next 20, 30, really even into today, lobbying hard that more taxes get spent on car-only infrastructure and that any of the streets give more space to cars. And keep in mind, as I continue to talk about some of this stuff, there's a lot of decisions that as we go through, keep in mind, this is essentially 30 people in a room have made the decision for our entire society and where we've taken our society over the last 7,500 years. So they started lobbying hard to get that infrastructure. They also started to put out propaganda about how the car is going to pave the way, make it a prosperous place, how that's the way of the future. And then in 1939 at the World's Fair, which got lots of traction, they showed off a concept called Futurama, which was towns and cities that look really cool with big, wide roads. And I'm going to do a little bit of foreshadowing here. Start to think about the way our roads look today and how successful this may have been when they showcased all of this. So they showcased what the city of the future could look with all these cars, these big interchanges, highways. So I love this one because you can actually see the people in the background viewing. I have a question here. And there's really two things, there might be more, but what two things are really missing from these diagrams or these models of Futurama? Jackson, any ideas?
Well, I do see highways kind of getting the main attention here. I'm trying to see if I even see any little pedestrian people.
You bingoed on the number one, the first thing. They didn't actually put people walking around. They just showed the cars. The other thing you don't notice from here is where are all the parking lots? So they kind of forgot those two pieces of the equation when they were saying this would be the better world if we had all these cars moving through and around our cities. Then in 1956, there was the Federal Highway Act, which Eisenhower signed. And that was a good thing. I don't want to say it wasn't a good thing. There were some good aspects of that Highway Act. And within that, though, what I want to point out is that there was this thing that says when we sign this Highway Act, when streets and roads are designed and built, you need to follow what's known as the Yellow Book. It's now turned into something called the Green Book, but it was the Yellow Book. And what that said was, how do you actually design the road? What does the roadway look like? How wide is it? How far do you go between curb or turns? Things like that. The thing to note about that is that book was written by GM and a few other auto industry people. No city planners, no park planners, nobody else was kind of helping write this book. It was written specifically by the auto industry. So as I mentioned, it was a pretty good thing, that Federal Highway Act. What it did is it established our interstate system, and nobody can deny our interstate system is really great. I would argue that we need a little bit of rail to go along with that and balance some things out, but overall it was a good thing. The one downside to this highway plan was not only was it connecting our cities and our towns, particularly our major ones, is they were saying we need to build these highways right through our towns, so directly through the towns. And what this does, and you can see right in this picture now, is it divided the town in two. People on one side of that highway made it much more difficult for them to get across. Now you could argue that, oh, we gave them a bridge, but how far away do people now have to walk down to get to that bridge, cross it, and then go back the other way if they were just simply trying to cross? The other thing people often say to me when they see pictures like this is, yeah, but that's big cities. And I say, no, it's not, because if you take a look at many of our communities, I always think of, even Kirksville, just north of me here, all major MoDOT highways now go through towns, just cut right through towns. when MoDOT builds their highways through towns, they don't take into consideration, the town square. How's it going to affect the town square? How is it going to cut the town in half? There's another town that's just north of here that all the neighborhood kids live on one side of the MoDOT highway, but the school's on the other side. And so we're still building these big roadways that are out of context for our small communities and rural communities in Missouri. They also, another big negative side effect to these big roadways is the concept of urban renewal started to come in. And what urban renewal is essentially targeted demolition of blighted neighborhoods. In other words, targeted demolition of poor and people of color neighborhoods. And again, this isn't just big cities. In fact, there's an example of it right here in Columbia, and Columbia is not a very big town. It's bigger than some of our rural places, but it certainly has its history of urban renewal. And we still even see this today, where people will look at a highway build and say, well, what's the more poor part of town? Can we demolish that and put these highways in? In this picture, you can see in Detroit, I mean, you can look at the entirety of the picture and you can see, obviously it's black and white, so it's a little difficult, but all the number of buildings and houses and the grid pattern and street. Imagine how many people are fitting within this. And then if we go to a picture of today, the circle is where those neighborhoods, those thriving neighborhoods were, and they've basically been wiped clean. And if you start to look at the rest of the map, you see a lot more green, you see a lot more parking lots, you just see a lot more gray asphalt and concrete poured. You don't really see neighborhoods and lots of buildings, which were those thriving neighborhoods and thriving businesses that contributed to living in what I call a 15-minute city. 15-minute city, for those that may not know, is a city where you can do 75% of your business within 15-minute walk of your home. Now, that's not always going to be the case because some people may need to drive further for their jobs, but being able to access the rest of your services, school, healthcare, food, whatever it is, within probably about a 15-minute walk is what we used to have and has been kind of erased now. Another thing that the auto industry did, which was pretty dark in my opinion, was they started to buy up all the major metro systems, so buses, light rail, even subway systems in many of our major cities, and then they started to defund them. So I'm going to ask that question there. What was the implication of buying these up and defunding them?
People who couldn't afford cars were left to walk.
I'm gonna guess again, but I mean, if you don't have public transportation and you're spanning longer distances, you're more dependent on cars.
Right.
That was the question.
Yeah, so that's essentially it. The system started to stink. It was like, this doesn't work for me anymore. I used to ride the bus all the time, but it doesn't work. And so there's like, I should probably buy a car. And so when they bought that car, the next thing that happened was all of a sudden you as a car owner were like, well, now I have to use this car and I want to be able to use it in a very efficient manner. You've all of a sudden gotten yourself another person who's in support of the car industry's push to widen and widen and widen the streets. So it was kind of a twofold system. It even got darker than that. They started in those initial plans back in that yellow book, they started to design things like this bridge you see here in this picture that are too low for buses to actually even get through. So even in places where they still had buses, you couldn't get through here. And this is well documented that they usually did this to divide Black and poor neighborhoods from white neighborhoods, because we knew that the lower income people and the Black neighborhoods didn't own cars originally. They tended to use the bus more often. So they use this as a way to divide our cities. They don't have that design anymore, but some of these bridges are still in place, as you can see from this picture. So the other piece of propaganda that kind of came out of all of this was the Federal Housing Act. And when that came out, it was an idea that we would start to give an influx of money to people. So it changed the loan standards to get money into people's hands, and so that they would buy homes to kind of reinvigorate our economy, both after the Great Depression and after the wars. The problem was when they changed this, and if you were to get one of these loans, they came up with a lot of rules and regulations about who they would give the loans to and what types of houses they would give the loans to as well. They tended to only give the loans to white people, and they only tended to give the loans to like houses and neighborhood designs that were really car centric, and they had very big wide streets. They also were even places where it says if you have a neighborhood, you have to have segregation lines drawn in. So this led to redlining. So it was had some very negative consequences. The big thing that I think it did as well is it centralized our homes and business services, that separated them. In those earlier pictures I showed you, people lived fairly close to the services they need. They may have been further from their jobs, but they were closer to the other services they need. Schools, hospitals, all those types of things were much closer. What this did is it spread it out where we have suburbs, we have shopping districts, and it really separated them out to the point that you needed a car. It also didn't give us quite the American dream we wanted. We all assumed that this American dream was something that we as Americans came up with on our own. Unfortunately, this term American dreams of a house and a yard on a big wide street that you drive on, that was really developed again by the auto industry and some of the government that was trying to reinvigorate our economy. And so they came up with this idea of the American dream. Unfortunately, when I look at this picture, this is the most common neighborhood design that we see in the United States currently. It doesn't strike a lot of good dreams for me personally. It doesn't seem like a place I necessarily am excited to go and live. The other thing it does is, I mentioned it, decentralized. It means now instead of our towns looking a little bit more like those first early pictures I showed you, they start to look like things like this. This is a neighborhood context. And what it does is it increased lot sizes, increased road width. They didn't put things in like sidewalks. This spread everybody out so much that if a kid lives here and they want to walk to play with their friend, they have to walk so far that no parent is going to let them walk that distance, and generally over and around dangerous roads that, again, no parent's going to allow them to get to on their own. In the business districts, I mentioned this picture earlier. This is the most common business type road in our society now. Again, people aren't going out and walking and enjoying life and living in areas like, or around areas like this. That person walking there, I'm sure, is not happy. I think they are walking probably because that was the only choice that they could make, was to walk down this road. Another fine example, remember I said the one thing they left out in Futurama besides the people were the parking lots, a place we needed to put all of those cars. And so on the very top end of this picture is where all the neighborhoods are. Everything is very spread out. Down at the bottom, that's where all the businesses are. You still need a place to put all those cars. And so they have to put parking lots. So even if you can see on the screen there, and one part of the business, there's a Best Buy. And I'm sure there are some restaurants that are across that parking lot. They've done studies. Most people would get back in their car and drive across the parking lot as assume walk across to the restaurant. So essentially what it's come up with, this is a bit of a comic, is we've started to turn our streets into places that look like this, where it is not safe for people to be out walking, particularly not riding a bike or using public transit, but it's really taken the space away from people's to be out and about in their communities and given it over to the car, and made it very dangerous for people to be anywhere but on the sidewalks, if there's a sidewalk at all. And I think they're being a bit generous that this sidewalk in this picture is wide enough for that mom and that kid to walk side by side. Most instances, the sidewalk width design is so that people have to walk single file. So I'm going to ask the question, and this one, I'm hoping Jolynn can start us off, or Jackson. What have been the results of this car-centric zoning?
I guess that's me to start it off. So for the health implications, I mean, it's very obvious that fewer people, especially since like the 70s is when I start looking at it, and obesity rose. They're not biking to work, they're not walking to work, they're not using car, or they are using cars for pretty much every trip, even if it's under like 2 or 3 miles. And I don't think I need to pull up the stats on how our sedentary behavior has changed and that's affected health in general. So that's my kickoff.
One thing that I noticed reminded me of a program that a colleague does about neighboring and how our towns are set up in this way, not only to not promote walking or biking or other modes of transportation, but also just to kind of stay within your home and not be
Mhm.
part of a community and part of the neighborhood.
Absolutely. Very right. So I'm going to move on. Thank you for that participation. Jackson, you came off. Did you have something to add?
I was just going to ask if I'd be curious to learn more from Lindsay at some point about that topic itself. I'm just thinking about this because like my 5-year college reunion is coming up. That environment was set up where all of me and my friends lived in a very short, nearby area. So we would all just walk and then happen to run into people that we knew, have those community connections. But once everybody leaves that environment, is living somewhere else, it's much less likely that you will have those same kind of level, at least, of neighborly connections. So I would be interested to hear more from Lindsay at some point about that.
Yeah, great.
It's kind of interesting because it's not like, it's not like segregation, but in a way, the way the communities are set up like that, because you have your like nicer communities in this area, you know what I mean? It kind of still has that flow in some cities, some places, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know I was here to kind of talk about street design and complete streets, but I bring up the piece about zoning and where we put things and how far away things are, because, and we have this in the United States where there are examples of communities that were designed with very great infrastructure for people to walk on and bike on and have calm driving along the roadways, but they still tend to have very low rates of people actually out walking or biking or going places because of the zoning still meant things that they wanted to get to were so far away that it was even hard for them to get to them. Even if it was a playground that was technically in the neighborhood, if it's well over a mile away, it's really hard for a kid to walk to that playground. Those that have kids and have tried to walk a mile with them know how annoying that is. So think about that from terms of if they're trying to walk to a school or anywhere, even though the infrastructure is there, we've zoned things out of reach for ourselves. So I put up a slide here of the results, and these are all proven by research and studies, but there are, when you do this type of design, lower rates of physical activity and happiness. In fact, your commute is the only thing they've ever been able to find truly makes you happier based on what type of commute you have. And they obviously found the longer your commute is, the unhappier you are. And if you use biking, walking, or public transit, if you have access to those and are able to do them, that you tend to be happier throughout your life. Obviously, higher rates of obesity, stress, anxiety, depression, high blood pressure. So all the things that are related to sedentary lifestyle. The other piece of this is the cost of living. Cost of living has significantly increased with this type. It costs on average in the United States $9,000 to own a car annually. So that's annual cost is $9,000. And I'm sure that's gone up with the cost of cars going up and the cost of gas. But the cost of living is very high when you make it this type of lifestyle. There's also social costs, which I think we were talking about, which is connections, human connections, but also the rate of fatality and serious injury, which I brought up, and the cost to return on investment ratio. This type of infrastructure costs our society a lot of money to build and is not very productive and doesn't bring a lot of return. And that's a whole nother topic of conversation, the business side of all of this that I could spend another hour talking about. So why does street design matter? I think we've had a lot of conversation about why it matters, because street design determines if a street is safe and for whom it's safe. Obviously, if it's safer, it'll determine whether people walk, bike, or use transit. Especially, I'm going to bring out that perceived safety piece. And it determines how accessible, oh, I misspelled a word, I used the wrong R, our basic needs are. So what is a street design standard? Street design standard and a complete streets policy is just that. It's a city policy that determines what a street should look like. And the reason these complete streets policies are coming back and are fairly popular and being adopted around the state and around the country, and Jackson can tell you better than me, the number of communities in Missouri who have adopted these. Columbia was the first to adopt one. That was in 2004. We're in the process of trying to update it. But the reason they came into place is they started to realize that we forgot to include sidewalks when we build places. We forgot to include things like bike lanes and accessibility, even trees, and even how big the roads were. Nobody really reined any of that in and said, hey, we need to start including those things back into our communities. And so what a complete streets policy does is it says those things need to be included, and here's the widths of them and the number of them and where they should be placed. So it's generally a fairly technical document. Now I say technical, but it's actually quite easy to look at and understand. So complete streets are supposed to be safe and convenient for everyone. I mentioned that everyone term earlier on, but it should be safe and convenient for people walking, biking, or riding transit. It should definitely be safe and convenient for people using disabilities, older adults, children, and people of colors. And oh, by the way, if you do this, just as I talked about that kind of everyone concept or that universal design concept, it'll be safer and more convenient for people driving. We have the data on that from places that have continued to build in this way. Kind of gone over all this a little bit. So just to give you all a little information, this is what's known as a road or a street design. This is the more nerdy cross-sectional, and this is a very layman's one. There are some that get even more detailed about the widths, where the bike lanes go, where the trees go, sidewalks, their widths. Again, they can get more detailed ones. Most often times the public sees things like this, which is known as a street rendering. It leaves out all the numbers essentially and some of the terminology, but it just shows you what it could possibly look like. Our current standards, tends to be what our current standard looks like. Unfortunately, I do have to admit that this is considered a complete street here in Columbia. It does have some resemblance of a sidewalk. It does have bike lanes. It didn't go quite far enough. Again, this is that every street in the United States. I showed a picture of the gentleman walking on earlier. We tend to have streets that look like this. You can see that there's people actually walking in this street. And I'll come back to this street in a second. Oh, and by the way, this is a 35-mile-an-hour street. What's known as the 85th percentile. So what people actually drive on it is closer to 55 based on this design. Current standard, again, there's a little circle there. This is actually a bus stop here. So this is the type of infrastructure we're currently building, and we ask ourselves, why aren't people using their feet to get around more? Why aren't people using a bike to get around more? Why aren't communities more connected? And it's because really, who's going to go and do these types of things in this type of environment? Again, another one it's got a bike lane, it's got a sidewalk. This is a 50-mile-an-hour road with that 85th percentile of 65. So complete streets, the first thing that needs to be done is it needs to focus on equity. And by equity, I not only mean the other modes of transportations and people with disabilities and people of different ages. You do need to focus on neighborhoods that are poor and people of color. Those neighborhoods tend to be the ones that we've really left behind. And they're generally, more on the major roadways, the bigger roadways. Many of the roadways I've shown that people aren't doing a lot of walking and biking on, but those also tend to be the populations that have a much more difficulty affording a car. And so they do a lot more walking, they do a lot more biking, they do a lot more public transit use. And so the irony of it is they tend to do more of those types of transportation, but the way our system has been set up, they tend to live on or close to the roads that are the most dangerous for them and most unpleasant for them to be doing this type of activity. The other thing we need to do with complete streets, or complete streets tends to include, is you need to prioritize maintenance or updating versus new infrastructure and sprawl. This is a picture of, I showed this picture earlier. For the last 15 years, people have been asking for completed sidewalks on this roadway. It would cost about $3 million to do it. The citizens and community keep hearing excuses of why they can't do it. Unfortunately, this year they started this project in town. It's a $10 million project to put in a highway extension. Nobody lives here. No one's currently driving here. There is no demand to drive here, but yet the city was very easily found $10 million to build this, but not $3 million to put in a sidewalk. So Complete Streets focuses on updating and maintenance, and particularly updating and maintenance on things such as biking, walking, and public transit. That's not to say they don't do a little updating for car infrastructure as well. I want to make sure I point that out. We tend to prioritize in Complete Streets things like biking, walking, and public transit. This is a beautiful design. I know this is a bigger city, Indianapolis, but there are cheap, easy, quick implementations that can be done even in rural communities in Missouri that allow to give people the sense of safety of walking and biking that even this picture here gives. Again, another picture of the way we're helping to bring back that feeling of community and the ability to get out and walk and bike in your community and feel safe and like it's convenient. Roundabouts, a lot of people I don't know about all your communities, but Columbia is huge on roundabouts. We tend to forget about how a roundabout affects people walking, biking, or using a wheelchair, making sure our designs include infrastructure for those types of transportation. Complete Streets also need to focus on access versus mobility. And I understand I'm using MoDOT terms. Mobility in my world means your ability to get around. In MoDOT terms, mobility means your ability to get from point A to point B really fast in a car. Access in MoDOT world means, can you get to a business? Can you get to a grocery store? And what we need to start to do is prioritize access over this mobility piece, because access is really the most important part. And on this roadway that I'm showing you here, people walking, people in wheelchairs, they can't have a tough time accessing the businesses along this roadway. And we know from studies that even the cars do. And the problem with this road is they're trying to do both. They're trying to have access, so lots of driveways, lots of lanes, but they're also trying to do mobility, which means move cars quickly. Those two things just don't mix. They end up being the worst of both worlds. Whereas if you see this design, which is a little bit different context, access is great here. Everybody can get where they need to go pretty comfortably, pretty safely. Cars are driving calmly. Once they get to a parking spot, they can get out and then access any of the businesses they need by foot. This even is important in neighborhoods. This is a neighborhood road. On this neighborhood, there's a preschool, there's a doctor's office, there are houses, there's a park on the left, there's a public library, there's a school, and yet very few people actually walk around here because this big road, this 4-lane road that is supposed to be a 30-mile-an-hour road, which people, the 85th percentile is around 40 to 45. It's very hard for people to access any of the stuff that lives around there, that is around there. As opposed to developing, and this is a rendering, a neighborhood that could still accommodate the same volume of traffic, allow a high volume of people biking. It's much more pleasant, much easier for people to cross these roads and these streets and get where they need to go. This is a thing I like to show everybody. The bottom picture is actually a design from way, way back, but before we really started to have a lot of those design manuals and everything I talked about. The top one is a current design that meets standard. Both of these are 20 miles an hour. One of them is designed like it. And I think that's important to point out. I think you can guess which one of these roads you see a lot of people walking on and kids playing in the street. Even in high volume areas or places where there's going to be lots of cars, there are ways to design to make it accessible for people walking and biking and using wheelchairs. So places where mobility is the priority, you can still make it safe for those other modes of transportation. This is just a good example of that. The next slide has a lot of details on it, so I won't read off all of them of what it means when you get down to the dirty nitty-gritty of Complete Streets and some of the design. Just for context, most cities already have those street design standards. They generally have about 20. That's what Columbia has. We think they need to be changed to have fewer to make it simpler. Netherlands, for example, they have 3 roadway designs. We could probably use a little bit more than that, but I think that the design needs to be based on land use context. So prioritizing what's happening on the land. Is it a neighborhood? Well, let's make the road focus on the neighborhood. Is it around businesses? Let's make the road focus that it prioritizes the businesses along that road. Same with industrials, parks, and parkways. We believe that most of the time when you're in a city that there should be only one lane, except for boulevards, which can be 2 lanes. We think lane width should be 10 feet. Let's get, I'm getting a little nerdy on some of the numbers here, but and there should be something that the design speed of a roadway, the design speed should match to the desired speed limit. That was a great example of, here, let me show you, back up. Well, maybe I won't. The picture where the neighborhood was 20 miles an hour, both pictures. Generally, when engineers design a road, they say, we want this road to be 35, but we're going to make the design speed 45 miles an hour. So what that does is it tells the driver as you're driving, I could drive 45 miles an hour on this road, but we don't think that that's the right approach, and that the design speed should be what the actual speed you want it to be. One thing I'll point out before I finish is none of this stuff I'm saying is, I'm not just making up these numbers and these designs. There are groups out there that have design guides. This is the NACTO. They have design guides that prioritize walking, biking, and public transit, people with wheelchairs. That also includes the design for cars and other things. This is the urban street design guide. They also have a rural street design guide. So all these things are out there for engineers and cities to look at and to implement into their own cities. And with that, I'm a little far. I'll open it up for questions for the last couple of minutes.
I have a question that might be loaded, and maybe I will take your brain about this another time. But so you're focusing on low resource neighborhoods, which I agree with. How do you prevent sort of the same thing from happening again, whereas walkable neighborhoods with good infrastructure are more desirable, and property values increase and people move in? How do you make it so it's really community investment versus gentrification and displacement again?
Yeah, and so we see that now. The reason the gentrification is happening, and we see there's a sample I showed with staff earlier of a town in Canada where it was a walkable, bikeable neighborhood and was fairly affordable. And then all of a sudden, people are like, that's the type of neighborhood I want to live with. I guarantee the majority of people you talk to want to live in a bikeable, walkable neighborhood where they can access a lot of things. The way to do it is you initiate it citywide. You can't necessarily just do those spot treatments. A lot of it has to do with density too. And so there's going to have to be a lot of infill that goes into place as well, because if you don't do the infill, that's when the gentrification kind of occurs. People move in and there's nowhere for anybody to go. And so they tend to be pushed out to a different neighborhood or on the edges of town. And so by continuing to do infill development, as well as doing it citywide as opposed to just spot developments where people are going to desire that one spot, it allows it to be system wide. And so is it going to be perfect? Are there still gentrification going to happen? Certainly. And there's some ways to work around that are other organizations work on that we look to help us with that. But if you can do it system wide, the gentrification tends to be minimized, I guess is the best way to put that. All right. Oh, there's another one.
I know I came in late to the party, but this was a great presentation. Thank you so much. And I like how you connected the physical activity component into it as well, like majorly into it, because I wasn't for sure how your presentation would go, but wow. Thank you so much for your time. This is great. Thanks, Jackson, for leading this up too.
I have one more question.
Sure.
So if we wanted to talk to our communities, like our city planners or our city government, about implementing complete streets, what's the best first step?
Best first step, I would reach out to, I'm not sure where you're located. Where are you located? Remind me again, Lindsay, you said.
I'm down by Joplin.
Joplin. I would reach out to Ozark Greenways and Jackson, and they would that would be the first thing I would do if I were you. Because we already have people kind of working in those areas who are already trying to do this type of work, and they would help bring you into, the coalition, so to speak. But if you're not one of those people, if you're not lucky enough to be one of those areas where the conversation has already started, I would still reach out to myself or one of the other organizations just to have a conversation. But the first thing you would start doing is that start talking to your neighbors. Starts asking them, or the community that you're working with, start asking them the questions about like, how is it for you to get around? How do you feel? Do you want to live in a walkable neighborhood? So you start to build the vision of what they want, and then you present the solution of the complete street. Like, here's a way we can kind of start getting there. So that's what we generally do when we work in communities. We have a whole community engagement group. They go into community and they just start making friends, and then they start talking about the topic. And then pretty soon they're like, yeah, we deserve walkable communities. And then it becomes their idea, and then we support them.
Oh yeah, I see where Jackson just put in the chat that Joplin passed a complete street policy in December. And then
Yeah.
Taylor is leaving us. I think she's going to Kansas City.
Taylor Cunningham, yeah.
Yeah, that's great that you folks know. We have worked with Taylor Cunningham on a couple of different projects. And yeah, she'll be going to MARC, which is, it's a whole other component of this whole thing. It's like funding gets diverted to regional planning commissions and metropolitan planning organizations. But yeah, Taylor will be moving on to MARC, which is the Kansas City MPO, or like Metropolitan Planning Organization.
So hopefully Joplin
Yeah.
sticks to the policy.
Yeah.
That's the next
Or
piece
brings
of it.
someone in as good as her.
Yeah, you've got to hold people's feet to the fire, because it's really easy for them to kind of slack on the policy.
That was an amazing presentation. Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks.
it's great.
All right, Jackson, I don't see any other questions. I'll hand it back over to you since you were leading earlier.
All right. Well, yeah, thank you, Lauren.